Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Thursday, June 11th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, bringing more students into public service starts with giving them a way in and a reason to see themselves there. But once they're in, the way federal jobs are defined can shape everything that follows. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. The House Armed Services Committee is pushing back against President Trump's executive order that removes collective bargaining rights for civilian workers in the Defense Department. Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis joins me with more details. Anastasia, great to have you.
Hi, Terry.
What is the core issue here that we're talking about?
Yeah, so HASC last week adopted an amendment offered by Congressman Donald Norcross to ban the Defense Department's use of fiscal 2027 funds to implement the president's executive order. A similar provision was introduced in 2026. However, it was ultimately stripped from the final version of the bill. But this particular amendment, it passed 30-26. So we had Representatives Mike Turner, Don Bacon, and Derek Van Orden. They sided with Democrats to support this measure. The issue has become a point of contention now as House and Senate lawmakers negotiate a final version of the 2027 NDAA, especially given how aggressively this administration has been executing its union-busting campaign. The Defense Department civilian employees are, of course, the latest to lose their collective bargaining rights, but Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth canceled virtually all agreements back in April. But at the same time, many agencies, including the Department of Veterans Affairs, FEMA, or the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and the Environmental Protection Agency, have moved to strip their workers of collective bargaining rights. Here's Congressman Norcross.
This is the largest single rollback of federal labor rights in modern American history. This is such recklessness that we in Congress, and more importantly, the American people, have been shown that the suspension of collective bargaining agreements was not, in fact, a national security issue, but just another step by this administration to make harm of our employees. In fact, what happened when Defense Secretary Hegseth was here, I literally asked him the question, are there any issues, were there any problems with any collective bargaining agreement that were covered by DOD? He could not cite one example of where this was an issue, and that's why we are here today.
Anastasia, I mean, no one really disputes that the president has the authority to exclude federal agencies from collective bargaining given national security priorities. So why are they pushing back so hard now against this executive order?
Yeah, like you said, presidents have had this explicit statutory authority for a very long time that allows them to exclude agencies and subdivisions from the federal labor relations statute if, of course, federal agencies' primary mission is intelligence, counterintelligence, investigative, or national security work. Overall, what the administration argues is that evolving foreign and domestic threats have broadened the scope of what constitutes national security work. And given that, agencies need greater flexibility to respond quickly to emerging challenges without being bogged down by things like collective bargaining obligations, grievance procedures, etc. And of course, previous presidents have used this authority. President Carter excluded parts of the NSA. President George W. Bush excluded certain parts of the Justice Department from collective bargaining rights, also citing national security concerns. However, that was never an issue the way it is an issue today. What's different is the scope. The administration says that it's up to the executive branch what the scope is. And ultimately, the president is the one who was elected to make these national security decisions, and Congress gave presidents that ability. But the unions kind of came back and said the statute was supposed to be very narrow in nature. It was supposed to be a narrow exception rather than this sweeping authority to remove bargaining rights across very large segments of the federal workforce. Congress wrote it for agencies in subdivisions like with functions of national security, but not functions like regulatory, administrative, or scientific. So what they're saying is that the president cannot really use this narrow exception to swallow this entire rule. But there's also another part to it, which is the political reality, where this administration is very open about managing the federal workforce very aggressively.
You mentioned the vote count, and it was pretty close. So not everybody in the committee was in agreement. For folks who voted against the amendment, what was their argument?
Yeah, this was passed very narrowly. Republicans are opposed to this, are arguing that these decisions to manage the workforce of National Security Agency should be made by the president. After all, Congress did give presidents this authority, and it's in the president's hands. Here's Republican Congressman Mike Rogers. He's the House Armed Services Committee chairman.
This amendment, in my view, unnecessarily restricts the president's authority to manage the workforce of our national security agencies, including the Department of Defense. The president is well within his authority granted by the Civil Service Reform Act to limit collective bargaining with federal unions that have a national security mission. In fact, he is not the first president to do so. Previous presidents have used the national security exemption to prohibit collective bargaining with the CIA and other national security agencies. Therefore, I regrettably have to oppose my good friend's amendment.
And I also wanted to include Secretary Hackseth's views on unionizing at the Defense Department. It's pretty succinct.
I fundamentally believe the Department of War should not be subject to collective bargaining, full stop.
You're right. Pretty succinct. What's next here?
Yeah, so this was only passed by the House Armed Services Committee. We'll see if the measure even survives on the floor. And like I mentioned, a similar measure was introduced last year, and there were many House Republicans urging Senate Republicans to support the measure, but ultimately there was only one Republican senator who pushed for the inclusion of this measure. So we'll see what happens next.
That's Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis. Thanks for keeping us up to date.
Thank you, Terry.
You can find her story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, bringing more students into public service not only starts with giving them a way in, it also requires a reason to see themselves there. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network.
Tune in Tuesdays at 10:30 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. for the Innovation in Government Show, sponsored by Carasoft. Hear from the industry leaders advancing the technologies shaping how agencies modernize, secure operations, and deliver better services. Innovation in Government covers what is changing now, what is working from cybersecurity and cloud to data, AI, and emerging technologies. Listen to Innovation in Government, Tuesdays at 10:30 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. on Federal News Network. Search Innovation in Government.
Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. A new program at Arizona State University is connecting students to federal service while they're still in school through a model that blends coursework with hands-on experience. It's part of a broader effort to strengthen the talent pipeline and widen access to government careers. Shannon Portillo, director of ASU's School of Public Affairs, is here to give us more information about the initiative.
Shannon, it is so great to see you today and to catch up on everything that's happening at ASU. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
You were working to unveil a new federal career track for ASU. We're going to talk more about the details of that, but I first want to hear why. What is it about federal workforce, the federal workforce, federal service that you are hearing and your students are hearing at Arizona that is still motivating them to come?
So I'm going to step back a little bit and tell you a little bit about when we started thinking about this program. So we started planning for this in fall of 2024. before the last election, I was hearing from more students than ever that they were really excited about the idea of public service. For many of them, they didn't think about government when they thought about public service. And for many of them, DC seemed really far away. They had no concept of how they would even start a federal career. But these were bright students, people who we want contributing. They just didn't really have a pathway there. So we started this program as a way to say, how can we set up a pipeline? How do we help students who are interested in public service understand what it means to work for the federal government? We planned this out in fall of 24. We started recruiting for our first class in January of 25. You would think that students would get very scared with what they started hearing, what was going on. That wasn't the case. Students were actually really energized because they said, I want to be part of the solution. So students weren't scared off by what was going on. They were doubling down on, I want to do something different. I want to contribute. I want to figure out how. But they still have a lot of questions about how do they contribute? What does that look like for them? How do they get here? How do they get connected? How do they get involved? And so this program is really designed to help students envision what a career can look like and think about all of the pieces to a career that are often, we call them the hidden curriculum. How do you network? How do you find a place to live? How do you actually transition from Arizona to DC? Because so many of our students have actually never left the state of Arizona before. So just the move piece becomes the challenge. And that's more of a challenge than thinking about federal service.
We think about federal service from the pipeline problem, how long it takes to hire somebody, where the recruits are going to come from. You're tackling this from the other side, what brings people into the pipeline. So walk us through what this program will actually look like for a student. How will it get them from ASU campus to federal service?
So we're building on 10 years of success with our Next Generation Service Corps. NGSC is designed to help students think about character-driven leadership and prepare students from any major at the university to think about public service. So students in NGSC complete 3 internships, one in the private sector, one in the public sector, one in the nonprofit sector. They work on mission teams, tackling a big social challenge together in a transdisciplinary way. They have scholarship support to help create time for that, but they really focus in on leadership development. NGSC 10 years ago was conceived of as a program for all 4 years of undergrad. We started having transfer cohorts so students could come in from a community college and do the program in 2 years. This program is designed for students to join as a junior, as a rising junior from any major, and they say, I'm interested in federal service. They join our accelerated Masters of Public Administration program. So they do those 3 internships. They do the leadership development. They have professional development in 2 years with us in Arizona while they finish undergrad. Then they come out to DC and they do a 1-year accelerated Masters of Public Administration at the ASU DC location, while hopefully doing another internship with a federal agency or in a federal government adjacent role and launch their career from there.
Dr. Shannon Portillo is Director and Co-Presidential Chair of the School of Public Affairs, the Watts College of Public Service at ASU. So Shannon, let's talk about that year in Washington. Why do you need to have those students here for that year? What is it about that experience that is going to really translate for them to federal service?
Yeah, as I mentioned, one of the things that students are nervous about is the moving to DC part. And so they come as a cohort. They already have 2 years of building relationships with their fellow students. They have 2 years of building relationships with our professors of practice in the school who will be with them here in DC. So that year in DC is really meant to help them build their professional network, develop their skills, and decide what they want their careers to look like. So this is a year for them to really get to know what it's like to work in federal service.
One of the challenges about being in DC is that you often need to know somebody to kind of get in. And so the programs at ASU really have a huge focus on first-gen students. How are you building a structure that can support a first-gen college student making the leap to DC, a year here, and then hopefully that transition to federal service?
That's why I'm here right now. Actually, our goal is to get ahead of this for students to help them build that network early before they arrive, to make sure that we're activating the ASU alumni and friends of ASU that we already have in the DC area, make sure that we're developing the skills that students need to build a network, helping them understand What are all of those kind of intangible pieces that help us have a successful career? So they're doing that professional development with us for all their juniors and seniors and undergrad. And then when they get here, we hope they're ready to hit the ground running, build up their own network, start those careers. And then this first cohort will help the second cohort, will help the third cohort. And the goal is to build that pipeline and everyone to lift as they climb.
I know you've been thinking about this program for a while before you started to roll it out. I'm curious, what have you changed in the traditional MPA curriculum to really help prepare these students for the 21st century world of government?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know that it's necessarily us changing the core curriculum, but it's changing our orientation to who we expect to serve in 21st century government. So as I mentioned, it's a transdisciplinary program. So we have students from engineering, from business, from public service, from emergency management. Our goal is to get students from all over because we need people with all types of backgrounds in federal service. The core curriculum, though, is really making sure that those students have a good sense of what does it mean to have strong management skills? What does it mean to have strong data analytics skills? How do they have strong communication skills? How do we think about technology and the evolving role of technology in government? So they'll have the same core MPA curriculum. Their electives will be really focused in on those internship experiences, the work experiences, and then thinking broadly about what does a federal career look like. So we will have an experiential internship course as part of this, but they'll have the same core curriculum of all of our MPA grads.
And as you think forward, your first cohort has 11 students. They're going to finish up this program in 2028, right? Think for me 5 years down the road. How does this program grow? How does it expand? How will you know if it's been successful?
Yeah, so ASU loves to do things at scale. We like to pilot, experiment, innovate, design, get feedback, redesign. 5 years from now, I'm hopeful that it may not just be cohorts of students from ASU, but we have 28 universities who are part of the Next Generation core network. And so how can we get more universities involved in this pipeline? How do we make sure that we're recruiting broadly across all of the majors at ASU? And then how do we get the resources to scale this up so any student who wants to make this journey can make this journey?
And so if there are federal agencies who might want to, get a finger on some of these folks during their year for internships, or private sector nonprofits, where do folks go to learn more about the program?
Absolutely. So I would love if folks would contact me. I'm happy to share my email address so that people can get in direct contact. But on our Next Generation Service Corps website, we have an accelerated federal career track page on that website. So folks can take a look at it, see what we're doing, and get in contact. We are very open to internships in federal agencies, nonprofit, in the private sector. We want students to have access to the full range of experiences.
I've been speaking with Dr. Shannon Portillo. She's the director and core presidential chair at the School of Public Affairs, Watts College of Public Service, Arizona State University. Shannon, thanks so much for joining me. Thanks for creating this amazing program. We're excited for what may happen.
Thank you. I really appreciate the time to chat about it. We're excited for our students to get out here and start learning.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, what looks like stability in today's workforce may actually be caution as more people choose to stay put in an uncertain economy. But first, if people aren't moving, part of the story may be how federal jobs are defined in the first place. You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Efforts to improve federal hiring and pay often run into the same problem. The system that defines jobs has stayed largely the same, even as the work itself has changed. Here to walk us through the problem and a path to modernization is Gabe Menchaca, a former OPM official and now senior policy analyst at the Niskanen Center. Gabe, welcome to the show. It's great to have you. Thanks for joining me.
So glad to be here.
We talk a lot and look a lot at reform proposals for federal HR, whether that's hiring or pay or performance. And a lot of people have a lot of good ideas that go nowhere. You've got a new paper out that says that's because they're trying to build on a broken foundation. How do you diagnose the core problem?
Yeah. So when you think about hiring, right, you get hired into a job. When you think about performance management, you are measured against a standard for your job. When you think about removing someone from a job, well, there's a job at the bottom of that in the first place. And so I think when you look at the entirety of federal personnel, we haven't gone deep enough to ask the right question, which is, are we even really offering the right jobs in the first place, right? And the way that we structure jobs in the federal government, as folks who've been around town for a long time know, is the general schedule. And at the bottom of that is a really archaic and arcane position classification system that is really the sort of taxonomy and the grammar for how we describe government jobs, construct government jobs, and really figure out what the work of government is in the first place. If we don't get that right, the choice of who to hire or into what job someone might be hired or how to manage them is never going to show the results that we really want as a government.
So the position classification system has been around for a long time. And when folks hear you say, we really need to fix it, some people might go, yay, terrific. And some people are like, no, please don't mess with the classification system, because there are good things about it and bad things about it. Talk about that tension.
Yeah, absolutely. So I should say the GS as it exists right now is actually the fourth system that we've had for classifying federal jobs over the last 250 years. And it's important to know that I don't think Congress, when they designed the GS, ever assumed that it was going to be the terminal state of affairs, right? But they did try to do a few things with it. So one, they tried to design it for absolute internal equity, right? And it does quite a good job, right? Lots of employers struggle with, ensuring pay equity across various demographic or occupational groups within an organization. And the GS does a remarkable job of ensuring that today, right? And so we should acknowledge that, right? That's what Congress designed it to do, and they did a good job. But at the same time, that type of absolute internal equity, while super well suited to the government that we had when the GS was designed in 1949, is really out of sync with the labor market as it exists today, right? Employers of all types in all sectors, both in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors, largely moved away from those sort of rigidly internally equal systems over the last several decades. And so the government is left with this sort of model today that really is sort of out of time and out of sync with what modern labor markets look like and what modern workforces really demand.
OPM is starting to look at some of these position classifications and potentially eliminating some of the old ones. When you look at steps like that, are they getting at the underlying problem that you were describing, or are they just kind of putting a Band-Aid on a big wound?
Yeah, I would think of OPM's current work as really the latter. So what they're doing right now is looking at some of the underutilized job classifications that exist today and trying to sort of reel those back in and kind of fold those into broader standards. That's a great exercise. That's something, by the way, OPM always has done and always ought to be doing, both the creation and the deprecation of occupational categories. But at the end of the day, that's not going to solve the problem here, right? Because the entire system is designed to translate an entire economy onto one pay table today. And nothing that OPM is doing in sort of the current environment is going to change that basic fact and the basic tensions that result from that.
Gabe Menchaca is Senior Policy Analyst at the Niskanen Center. All right, Gabe, presidents of both parties have tried to reform this system and have generally been, again, unsuccessful. The paper suggests some pretty clear concepts and structures. How do you start reform without throwing the baby out with the bathwater?
So the most important thing, and, I think in my paper, I really look through this entire history of the topic for the last couple hundred years. And one of the things that I found as I was doing my research is that the most durable systems and the ones that actually get over the finish line in reform are those where Congress really took the lead in design. And so to your original question, right, why haven't presidents of both parties been successful? I would argue that's because Congress really hasn't led the way. And so when we think about the strategy we're pursuing and the things that I'm interested in, it really starts with getting Congress up to speed, getting staff and members ready to have a serious conversation about what the government ought to look like in the future, how to compensate those people, and really what the values that are inherent in the civil service ought to be.
Are you encouraged then with the new workforce caucus that's been created? Is that a place where you would start to build that expertise?
I am encouraged. I think it's really nice to see sort of a renewed focus on the federal workforce on Capitol Hill. You know, at the end of the day, for all the conversations about unitary executive theory or sort of, exotic accountability schemes and all that, the basic fact is that Congress gets to create the jobs and the president gets to fill them. And so I'm really excited about the prospect of Congress reasserting its constitutional role in designing the federal workforce. And so we see that in the Workforce Caucus, but we see it elsewhere too, right? We're going to need a lot more allies that don't just focus on the federal workforce in order to get this over the finish line. And in fact, I'm also super excited to see members from both parties and caucuses like the Build America Caucus really look at personnel and state capacity more broadly as being on the critical path for all of their other reforms, right? So if you think about permitting reform, right, that's not going to get over the finish line without a permitting workforce that's capable of pulling that off.
So the paper offers 6 design principles and 5 core components. I'm not going to ask you to enumerate all 11 of those pieces, but what are the fundamental features of a modernized classification system?
Yeah, so the most important one, and I think this would be the biggest change for most of the federal workforce, is really moving away from a single pay table, right? And today, obviously, we have a single pay table modulated by a whole host of locality areas and special pay authorities and all the rest. But at the end of the day, my proposal hinges on a move from the single pay table GS to pay tables based on occupational families, right? So that would look like a pay table for folks who work in HR, a pay table for folks who work in budget and finance, one for life sciences, right, and all the rest. And that enables us to calibrate to the labor market in a way that the GS just never is going to be able to, right, because it moves up and down as one. And so we can begin to fit the federal government to the way people think about their careers in the first place, right? We are competing as an employer in the budget and finance job market, not in the federal employee job market when we're hiring a budget analyst, right? We are competing in the legal job market when we hire an attorney. And I would argue that the GS's focus on sort of cross-government, internal, absolute pay equity makes it very difficult for us to do that today.
Don't we sort of have that, but in another way? I mean, we have Title 38 for VA employees. We have Title 10 for DOD. We have special cyber hiring authorities. We have a lot of exceptions to the general pay table. We
do. And I would argue that's actually part of the problem, right? So if you talk to members of Congress and their staffs, or you talk to someone at OMB or OPM, and you ask them about whether the federal government and the federal workforce is governable, they would tell you that the federal workforce and the civil service system has largely become so complex, so riddled with those exception cases and special cases that you mentioned, that it's quite hard to actually manage it, right? Someone once likened it to me to sort of a Victorian house that you've inherited. So it's really hard to make changes to because you're not sure whether one cable running from room to room is actually connected to something. And so you're hesitant to cut it, right? And so when Congress is trying to make changes, whether as part of the annual appropriation cycle, an NDAA, or otherwise, it's really challenging for them to actually legislate on the topic because there's so many exceptions that, they can't actually figure out what they need to change.
I do get a sense of urgency from this paper that AI is going to make all of the problems that you've described exponentially more difficult and more critical. Talk to us about how that's going to work.
Yeah. So today we have, if you've ever looked at a federal PD, right, they're largely long descriptions of tasks, right? Do this, engage with X stakeholder, so on and so forth. Those tasks are no longer going to be stable, right? And in fact, having a classification system that is task specialized is going to run into really significant challenges dealing with a white-collar automation technology that actually destabilizes those tasks rapidly and actually means that you're not going to do many of them, right? So rather than focusing on a whole big list of tasks that you have to get through during the day, workers of the future are largely going to be focused on outcomes, right? And so if we have a general schedule where your ability to perform a task is the thing on which you are compensated, When that task goes away, the system isn't going to work anymore. And so I argue in the paper that this is really about moving to an outcome-based classification system where the specific thing you do during the day is create marketing or create a budget or host a radio show or write policy papers, right? And that's much more in sync with where the economy is going and where AI is going to leave us in the future.
Now that the paper's out, do you have a sense that OPM and the executive branch, along with the legislative branch, are picking up any of that sense of urgency? Are you seeing initiatives move forward that might begin the reform process?
Well, I certainly hope so. And I should say we go and talk to everyone under the sun who will listen to us, right? Because I really think that this is something that Democrats, Republicans, career staff, political staff, and all the rest can get behind. And so, I'll be doing a whole lot of appearances on shows just like yours to have that conversation over the coming weeks. And we're really hopeful, right? I think at the end of the day, lots of people have reached out to say, hey, you hit on a lot of things that I've always been bothered by about the system. And I'm really excited by the prospect of finally changing it. So we're optimistic, and more importantly, we're realistic about how to get this done, and we'll be out pounding the pavement to generate that interest.
Gabe Menchaca is Senior Policy Analyst at the Niskanen Center. Gabe, thanks so much for joining me and for walking us through the paper.
Thank you, Terry.
We'll post this interview and a link to the report at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, what looks like stability in today's workforce may actually be caution as more people choose to stay put in an uncertain economy. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. This moment in the labor market looks stable on the surface, but underneath it's driven by caution and constrained choices. Workers are holding on rather than moving on. Here to break down some new survey data on this behavior are Matt Terry from the Economist Enterprise and Brendan McCarthy from Nuveen. Brendan and Matt, it is so great to have you both. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Matt, I'd like to start with you. This new research out for the Economist Group talks about the quit rate. We talk about the unemployment rate. We talk about a lot of labor metrics. What is the quit rate, and why should we be paying attention?
Yeah, so the quit rate is the rate of people quitting their jobs, basically. And that rate has actually fallen to a low. It's been the lowest in probably the last decade. So workers are not leaving their jobs as frequently. They're kind of job hugging is what we've called it in the research at unprecedented levels. And it's not always because they love their jobs. We see economic turbulence going on right now, hiring freezes, increased redundancies with the rise of AI. So there's just a lot of uncertainty going on, and people are increasingly opting for predictability in their employment, stable incomes, and stable benefits. So people are opting increasingly for predictability, stable income, and stable benefits over potentially promising prospects at a new job. So they're less likely to jump from job to job and more likely to just hold on to what they've got. We found in our survey that 62% of respondents said in that sort of trade-off, they would choose long-term job security over higher pay. So we really see kind of a trend setting in that we've labeled the great stay, where people are just sticking in their jobs.
In a healthy labor market, what would you expect that quit rate number to be?
It's traditionally been a little bit higher than it has been. I don't have the exact figure with me right now, but I think it's around 2% right now. So quite low. And one thing we find is that in the last 5 years, our respondents have stopped job searching, specifically due to the fear of losing that security. So we found 30% have reported stopping their job searches, and half say they have done that within the last 12 months. So rising insecurity is really kind of on the increase and happening across the board.
Brendan, what thoughts do you have about the quit rate?
We definitely see it here. As a hiring manager in a competitive industry, I'm always trying to recruit top talent, and sometimes I'm successful. And a lot of times lately, people do not want to leave their their job security. And I think some of that has to do with, if you think of the environment that we came out of. So we're, I don't know what we are, 5 or 6 years now out of the pandemic. And that was a major shift. And a lot of people took career risk during the pandemic. And some of it, they might have gotten used to what was a virtual environment for a short time being that came back to normal. And you hear, I think we all probably know of people that took a major career change back then. A lot of those might not have paid off in the long term, So I think a lot of us know people that might have been displaced and then tried to re-enter a thriving economy, but also an inflationary period with increasing costs of living, and may have ended up in a difficult position financially. And I think a lot of people are trying to avoid that now. And so I think that plays in a little bit to the psyche of employees, that they really do value job security. They will pass up on a greater opportunity to go into a new firm, to just, if they feel secure and comfortable in their job and they know their paycheck is dependable, they are a lot of times passing on opportunities and just staying where they feel comfortable and secure.
Well, Matt, let me come back to you. Speaking about uncertainty and job security, let's talk about the subset of your respondents that are from the federal government. Those folks have gone through a lot of uncertainty over the past 18 months or so. What does the data tell you about how they're perceiving job security, mobility, and their quit rate?
Yeah, so we don't have a quit rate statistic, I don't think, for government employees specifically, but our survey was conducted late 2025. So, right at the tail end of a lot of federal layoffs and a lot of uncertainty going on there. And we did see strong trends among government workers for prioritizing job security. We asked a question of them: what keeps them working in government? What are the biggest factors for why they stay? And job security was the number one on that list. I think 60% of respondents marked that among their top choices. So it is top of mind, although at the same time, government employees do express some of the least fear of losing job security. Perhaps that's just, the nature of their work and the jobs that they're in. But some interesting trends there, definitely in the data.
I'm speaking with Brendan McCarthy. He's the head of retirement investing for Nuveen, and Matt Terry is research manager for the Economist Enterprise. Brendan, let me come back to you because there's some data in this survey about retirement planning. So we're talking about job security, but in this turbulent kind of environment, you mentioned inflation, some other things. Are people delaying retirement? And if so, what are they thinking about when they're thinking about retirement planning?
Yeah, and unfortunately, people are delaying retirement. We're seeing delays in retirement. Even in the government sector that we just talked about, people are delaying retirement up to 3 years. It's 4 years or longer in the private sector. So they're delaying retirement because they are seeing this. There's a couple of major contributing factors. One is this increased cost of living. So they're seeing the increased cost of living, but to add to that, they're living longer. So if you take a 65-year-old today, which is the number you should be looking at, you shouldn't be looking at general U.S. life expectancy. You should be looking at 65-year-olds. A 65-year-old today has a 25% chance of living to age 95 or longer. So, in fact, a 65-year-old couple, there's a 46% chance that one of the two of them will live to age 95 or longer. So now people are living 30 years or longer in retirement. And unfortunately, what's happened is guaranteed income has all but gone away in the private sector. So, a generation ago, go back 30, 40 years ago, 70% of American workers who had access to a workplace retirement plan in the private sector were in a DB or a pension plan. Those have gone away. That number's down to 11% today. So most are in a 401k plan, and we have this new generation of workers retiring predominantly without any form of guaranteed income other than their Social Security, which we know is not enough. And so they're feeling very insecure approaching retirement. And as such, you're dealing with this new, it's a common term out there, the reluctant retiree. And that, for corporations in particular, that can have a heavy toll on the bottom line because you are increasing. It has a dramatic, you can talk to any CFO, it's a very dramatic effect on workforce costs when people delay their retirement 1, 2, 3 years or longer. So it's not great for the company. It's not great for the individual either. You want them to be able to retire on time and not feel like they should be able to work up and through their expected retirement date. And that all comes down to retirement security. I'll go on for this just a quick, what do they do? Fortunately, this is heavily recognized down in Washington. So there's a lot of work going on in Washington to bring guaranteed income back to retirement plans. And there's been a number of bills passed already. And in fact, there's a number of them floating around that will propose actually requiring retirement plans to have a guaranteed income option for employees so that the American worker can now work up to their retirement and then feel that they have a secure retirement. You can actually get that pension. You can get that guaranteed income that is associated with a pension, which has gone away for most Americans. You can now actually get that through your 401k plan. So there's products that have come to market and there's legislation that's been passed that enable your workplace defined contribution plan, whether it's a 401k, 457 or 403b, it can now have an option of guaranteed income. So what was historically a savings, just a retirement savings plan, can now also be a retirement income plan for the American worker.
Matt, let me come back to you. You mentioned a term up at the beginning of this conversation, job hugging. It used to be sort of an article of faith that if you wanted to progress in your career, you were eventually going to need to move somewhere, take a different job, maybe change companies. If people are hugging the current job and they're not making those kinds of moves, what's the long-term implication for that in terms of career advancement, increased salaries, job progression?
Right. No, it's definitely a big concern. Obviously, with people less likely to, jump from job to job, pursue those traditional career development pathways, there is a risk for them that they kind of remain locked into certain situations. And so it's a trend that we're keeping a close eye on in the research. I mentioned a stat earlier that 60% of government employees are prioritizing job security at the moment as one of the reasons why they stay where they are. Along with that, just 22% said that opportunities for professional development or training are keeping them in their jobs. So it's much lower on the priority list and maybe an area that should be looked into a little bit more as something that can be implemented to help these workers who need those career opportunities.
Brendan, let me come back to you. Let's think about policy lessons that you take from this data. You talked about one, which is recreating the opportunity for more fixed income structure in retirement. Are there other policy lessons you'd want folks to take from the data in terms of workforce management or workforce incentives or the benefit compensation structure?
I think the key thing is benefits matter, and they're mattering. The pricing on benefits has changed. They matter more now to employees than they did a generation ago. We are seeing all sorts of signs of workers choosing jobs for lower pay because of a better benefit package. And I think, primarily amongst the benefit package is the retirement plan. If you think of government sector, we talked about that being one of the most insulated sectors historically. It was, we talked about job security, which was key. People feel secure in government jobs, or historically have, I should say. They also knew their retirement. So they knew they worked a certain amount of years because government jobs historically have had pensions. They knew what was, coming to them in terms of retirement, and that provided them with security. And that, unfortunately, for the private sector, that has gone away. So I think, in terms of policy reform, there has been an unprecedented amount of retirement policy reform already. There was the Secure Act of 2019, and then there was the Secure 2.0 Act of a couple of years ago. There is already work on a version of Secure 3.0 going on down in Congress. So you're going to continue to see that retirement policy reform, but a lot of it is geared towards, in particular, that fact that pensions have gone away in America for the majority of American workers. guaranteed income is no longer something they can count on in retirement. And Washington wants to see that come back. I've seen estimates of upwards of 3 or 4 trillion that would fall back onto social services if, we have this volume of people, which EBRI, I'll give you one statistic. The Employee Benefit Research Institute is now estimating that upwards of 40% of American households are at risk of running out of income in retirement. So it's a real risk, and Washington's aware of it. And it is one of those issues that does fortunately have bipartisan support, and they have been moving on it. And I think you'll continue to see that retirement reform so that for the American worker in the future, and a lot of it is starting now. A lot of your companies can get these products now, but Washington will help mandate. We feel that Washington's heading towards a place where they will require your workplace retirement plan to provide you with that option of easily converting that hard-earned retirement savings into guaranteed income.
And Matt, last question to you. Does this data change what's maybe been the conventional wisdom about the federal worker willing to settle for lower pay because of a better benefits package and a dedication to the mission? Does this tell us they're getting more salary sensitive?
It's possible. There are some signs in our data that show government workers are maybe more likely to prioritize pay in certain cases. So times are changing. The stability that was once, very common in government jobs may not be as common anymore. But yeah, it just goes to show that workers have very changing priorities.
I'm most interested, this administration seems to think that hiring government workers is a very elastic labor market. And I think that's kind of counter to conventional wisdom. Like, if we lose 300,000 whenever we want more, we can just hire more.
Yeah, I don't want to speculate too much on what the administration's doing, but, there are obviously a lot of risks in making big workforce decisions like that affect a lot of people. People feel a tie to their jobs, and they need some baseline level of security. And if they don't get that, we definitely see their willingness to, prioritize benefits, prioritize, different things that they need to fit their changing situations.
I've been speaking with Brendan McCarthy, Head of Retirement Investing for Nuveen, and Matt Terry, Research Manager at The Economist Enterprise. Thank you both for joining me. This has been a fascinating conversation.
Terry, thank you so much.
Thank you, Terry.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. The General Services Administration, the landlord for much of the federal government, says none of the owned or leased buildings it has data on meet the minimum occupancy standards set by law last year. But GSA is re-examining the data it's collected so far. Among its concerns, the data doesn't differentiate office space from rooms where employees aren't working. Federal News Network's Jory Heckman is here with more detail. Jory, thanks for joining me.
Hey, Terry.
What data does GSA have on its occupancy rates?
Yeah, so this is a first-time thing for GSA under the Use It Act, which former President Joe Biden signed in his last days in office. This is a piece of legislation that requires GSA to collect this data, and this is occupancy data for the 24 largest federal agencies. A couple asterisks there, and we'll get into it, but by and large, this is the first government-wide snapshot of these agencies and how full their federal buildings are. This is data that is collected any number of ways for a lot of buildings, especially in the D.C. area. That's being measured by badge swipes in and out of the building. That's a data point they already had, so they're repurposing that for a rough approximation of occupancy data. And so GSA, earlier this year, they, in March, put out their first draft of this Use It Act database showing where agencies currently are, kind of a snapshot in time of the data. And that's where we are currently with the collection of that data.
What's the mathematical formula here? That's what I'm wondering. How do you actually calculate occupancy rate, and what does the data show?
Right. So what they've been able to do is, in rough terms here, maybe oversimplifying things, but it's kind of the numerator being the number of employees in the building divided by the square footage of the building, and you get some approximation of this amount of space per this amount of employees. And the goal is to get to a minimum 60% maximum occupancy of the building. That's the benchmark under the Use It Act. And if agencies aren't meeting that threshold in their buildings, then the law tells them that they've got to do something about that. They've got to right size their office space. They've got to co-locate, bring other agency tenants into the building, do something to get those numbers up. And so right now, what we've seen with the data snapshot so far is that no federal building that submitted data is meeting that 60% threshold. Some get close. Some are in the 59.5%, just a nose under. But that being said, 60%, 60%. However, we did recently hear from the acting commissioner of GSA's Public Building Service, Andrew Hiller. He told House lawmakers that GSA is going back and taking a closer look at the data that they've collected so far because, as he tells lawmakers, the agency is not necessarily getting an apples-to-apples comparison right now with the data that it has.
The bill, the Use It Act, was really focused on total space, and so you're counting things like auditoriums, conference rooms, libraries, spaces where people shouldn't be reasonably expected to work during a given day.
Jory, you said this was GSA's first attempt to collect the data, so if they're going to go back and sharpen their pencils, how exactly are they going to refine the data?
They're going to go to the Federal Real Property Council that GSA leads. It actually co-leads that with the Office of Management and Budget. And so they've created an occupancy working group to review this very issue. It's front of mind for the Trump administration. It's front of mind for Congress, and has been since 2020 in the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic, when a lot of federal buildings were sitting largely vacant. That was this point of contention that lawmakers certainly were concerned about, saying, why are we paying all this money to maintain buildings that aren't being used? And so, especially now with the Trump administration's push to have federal employees in the office 5 days a week, they're trying to make sure that these buildings are being fully occupied, and if they're not, get rid of them. So this is something that's being brought before that council. They're going to spend some time taking a look at the state of the data, what more they can do to refine that data and make sure it's accurately measuring office space and not non-office space.
This is not a problem that's unique to government buildings. Every kind of office space wants to know their occupancy. Has GSA received any helpful hints from the commercial real estate market?
They did, yeah. So this is all, for greater context here, this all was being discussed during a recent roundtable held by members of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. And in that roundtable, we also heard from Tim Hutchins. He's the Executive Vice President for CBRE. And that company, they've taken a closer look at the state of federal buildings, and based on their study and analysis, they've found that on any given federal building, 65% of the total square footage is office space, and the other 35 is the auditoriums, the libraries, the things that Heller discussed. And so Hutchins, from his perspective, he says that you've got to keep that in mind as you look at the Use It Act data, that 65% of all the total real estate space is office space. And so if you're looking at square footage, it's really tough for agencies to realistically achieve the Use It Act metrics.
So, I think the commissioner has really hit on it. To enforce the Use It Act, you need good data, and good data needs to do two things. It needs to reflect the goals you're trying to achieve, and it has to be consistent.
So what happens next, Jory? Do they just redo the math? Do they have another report that's out? What will happen?
So we'll have to wait and see what the council comes up with, whether GSA kind of put some asterisks or qualifications on the data that is collected so far. One other thing that was interesting was to get the lawmakers' responses to what was being said in response to what Hutchins had to say about 65% of the buildings being office space. Scott Perry, the chairman of the subcommittee that was holding this roundtable, he said, well, if that's the case, then maybe we have to set the bar higher for occupancy. Maybe instead of 60%, we do 80%. That's just an example, something he was throwing out there. Not a hard and fast recommendation, but he said that, certainly the goal here under the Use It Act is making sure these buildings are fully occupied, and that's what he aims to do.
That's Federal News Network's Jory Heckman. Jory, thanks for this update.
Thanks, Terry.
You can find his story at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.